Okay, that's it. So I'm going to talk today about the strategic plan. And I think most of you are familiar with the OWEB FIP. And the OWEB FIP is just part of the strategic plan. The strategic plan encompasses more activities, more strategies than just the FIP. And the plan, just as a little history, was developed with OWEB FIP capacity funding. The idea is to fund what look like high-performing or potentially high-performing partnerships to develop a strategic plan. And OWEB's purpose in that was an understanding that watershed councils and all of their stakeholders operate better if they have strategic direction guided by a strategic plan. It's a prioritized approach, it's a comprehensive approach. And so OWEB knew that not all of the folks that they fund with capacity development will actually become a FIP, but they see it as a good event to have a strategic plan for watershed councils. And so in this case, we were fortunate that we were able to take a portion of the strategic plan, apply for OWEB FIP funding, and you know where we landed with that. That was successful. So I want to give you the big picture, and then I want to talk a little bit more about OWEB FIP and drill into that in a little bit more detail. So I'm sure that all of you have read the strategic plan. It's a big and complex document, and I want to apologize for that. It's like Mark Twain said, I would have written a shorter letter if I'd had the time. And in fact, I think the strategic plan is that way. It certainly could have been simplified, but it was quite honestly a rush to get it done over a 2-year period. 2 years might seem like a lot of time, but with strategic planning of this complexity, it was just barely enough time. I mean, literally Cheryl and I were working at the last minute to get the grant proposal in, all of that. So it was a big effort, and I want to thank all of you participating in today's call that took part in that effort. Okay. So I'm going to give you an overview of the strategic plan, sort of the big picture, and then I'm going to talk about the FIP strategy and the geographic focus, how it differs from the strategic plan because it's emphasizing native fish populations, restoration priorities and types, Clackamas project tracker. I want to talk a little bit about that, and then the project approval process. And then I want to close with sort of an emerging issue, which is cold water and climate change, and touch base on that. So the mission, as stated in the strategic plan, is broad, and essentially it emphasizes that the partnership which is obviously greater than Clackamas River Basin Council, collaborates on coordinated aquatic riparian and floodplain restoration, conservation, and habitat protection actions to enhance watershed health, support the recovery and sustainability of native fish populations, and contribute to the region's economic and social vitality. So you can already see it's very broad. It's focused on aquatic and riparian restoration, but also conservation and protection actions, watershed health, as well as native fish populations. So very broad, with the idea of contributing to the region. So who are the partners that are involved? And I think most of you know this, and it's codified in the OWEB FIP process and agreements that we have with OWEB. And so there's 2 categories of partners. There's the core and implementing partners. Those are folks that are actually doing projects out there. And then there is the supporting partners. What you see on the screen here are the core and implementing partners. It's the 4 watershed councils, obviously CRBC, Great Oregon City Watershed Council, Johnson Creek Watershed Council, North Clackamas Urban Watershed Council, and then it is these other entities, Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, Metro, Mount Hood National Forest, North Clackamas Parks and Recreation, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So all of these folks are parties to the OWEB FIP implementing agreement. And all of them have active projects that they'll be implementing with the exception right now in this biennium of Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District. They're not implementing any FIP projects to my knowledge at this time, although they're certainly supporting the partnership. And then Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, there's sort of a variation there. They're not receiving FIP money for on the ground actions. They're receiving money for monitoring the effectiveness of projects. The supporting partners, Clackamas County Water Environment Services, Clackamas River Water Providers, Portland General Electric, Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, are supporting the overall effort, in some cases providing funding. In the case of Clackamas West, they actually do implement projects on the ground, but they don't use OWEB funding for that. Portland General Electric obviously can provide funding. And in the case of Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, projects are implemented on their land, but in this case, CRBC will implement projects on their property. So this is, as I said, part of the OWEB FIP. It's part of the operating agreement that we have with OWEB. There is room within the partnership and a process in place to add new partners, but this is the current group. So partnership activities, and this builds off the mission statement, and it's also broad when you think about the overall strategic plan again, and it's really about restoring both watershed processes and habitats that are limiting fish populations, but also doing things that work on habitat protection, community outreach, promoting water quality, best management practices, BMPs, and conservation activities. So it's broader in terms of watershed health, while OWEB FIP really focuses on native fish populations, as I'll explain. So this is actually a diagram that's in the strategic plan, and it really shows the entire Clackamas partnership strategy and all of its components that are undergirded with the foundation of partnership capacity. And partnership capacity is obviously all the things that go into the administration of the program, Clackamas Project Tracker, fundraising, reporting, all of that. That's the foundation for all of these different actions. And when you think about it, the strategic plan takes on a finite number of those actions. So habitat restoration, landowner and stakeholder outreach, monitoring and evaluation. The other components, which are actually in the strategic plan, promoting best management practices and habitat protection, they are not directly in the OWEB FIP approved activities. So those are separate. They're in the strategic plan. And as I look at the strategic plan, it's the big tent that allows you to move strategically as you see it would benefit the watershed. And it gives you a framework for both implementing other practices beyond OWEB FIP, but also seeking out other funding sources like foundation grants, other kinds of grants. And the beauty of the way the strategic plan is set up is you can show that those activities will complement the substantial effort, the substantial investment that is going into OWEB FIP. Obviously, habitat protection action, promoting best management practices, those complement the FIP activities. So all those circles are OWEB FIP focus. The broader part of it is in the strategic plan. So if you think of the strategic plan as encompassing everything that's kind of in this blue diagram area here, and if you look at the other components and OWEB FIP, there's obviously an overlap of partnership organizations, Project Tracker, the ongoing administration, all of that. But within the strategic plan, it's looking at the whole watershed in terms of the geography. It looks at the entire Clackamas River Basin as well as the other geographies, and I'll show you a map in a second. Emphasis on habitat and watershed processes. So it's both habitat, watershed processes, restoration and protection, also water quality. OWEB FIP is a focused geography, which we define to OWEB, and I'll show you that. Its emphasis is on limiting factors. LFs is the acronym for it, for native fish. So the emphasis is on limiting factors for native fish. It builds on the Lower Columbia Conservation and Recovery Plan, and its focus in terms of activities are on restoring complexity and access. Restoring complexity in streams, things like large wood, but also access to off-channel habitat, floodplain areas, and in one case, in Johnson Creek, access into cold water tributaries, which they're addressing through fish barrier projects. So WebFIP is focused geography, emphasis on limiting factors for native fish, and it tiers off the Lower Columbia Plan. And the number one limiting factor cited in the Lower Columbia Plan is restoring complexity and access. So the geographic focus, for the strategic plan, it's the entire Clackamas River Basin, it's Abernathy Creek, it's the tributaries to the north of Abernathy Creek that flow into the east side of the Willamette, those urban tributaries, Reinerson Creek, Kellogg Creek, obviously North Clackamas Urban Watersheds Council, as well as Johnson Creek. It's from the headwaters to the Willamette. So that's the geographic focus of the strategic plan. The OWEB-FIP focus, on the other hand, varies from that. And as you can see from this map here, it focuses in on the Clackamas River in terms of specific river reaches. And in the upper Clackamas, that is the focus. It's on the upper and middle reach, as we define it, of the Clackamas River. We're not looking at tributaries in the upper basin. The focus is on the main stem. So that's where it departs from the strategic plan, and you have a more focused geography. In the lower basin, below PGE's projects there, the focus is on both the Clackamas River as well as the major tributaries. You know, obviously Clear Creek, et cetera, Deep Creek as you go down the basin. When you get into the lower basin, you have the adjoining areas that are in the other watershed council areas, Johnson Creek, Abernathy, North Clackamas. And then it includes a reach of the Willamette River from the mouth of the Clackamas to the Willamette Falls. So the river focus is 3 Clackamas reaches, and then the Willamette River, and then these lower Clackamas River tributaries, Deep Eagle, et cetera, Clear, and then the other watershed council areas, which are tributaries directly to the Willamette. So the strategic plan restoration emphasis is on, as I said before, habitat and processes, habitat restoration and protection. It includes habitat connectivity and water quality. And what I have here is a photo of Kellogg Dam. And the reason I put this in here is to underscore that while most of the focus of the strategic plan, and certainly the OWEB-FIP, is on in-stream habitat, we went through an effort of listing limiting factors, primary limiting factors for all of the tributaries. And this is the #1 problem in this particular tributary, is the dam. So any project proposals, any funding efforts can cite the strategic plan for Kellogg Dam because it is the #1 limiting factor in that system. So that's a really important point. That's something that's not funded by FIP. It's not an activity that's funded by FIP, but it provides an umbrella to pursue projects beyond FIP. So with OWEB-FIP, the restoration emphasis is on native fish. And that is part of OWEB's focused investment strategy. They have a focus on native fish. They have a focus on coastal coho. They have a focus on forest health. And I think there's a couple of other ones that I don't remember, but we tiered off of, for the portion of the strategic plan that was focused on OWEB, on native fish recovery. And if you look at the Clackamas, it is among the highest priority basins in the state for native fish recovery. So the FIP emphasis is on native fish, and our overarching way of characterizing this is we call it the Clackamas fish populations. Within the Lower Columbia Conservation Plan, the focus is on the anadromous portion of the native fish populations in the Clackamas: fall chinook, spring chinook, chum, and coho. Pacific lamprey, and steelhead. Pacific lamprey, obviously there's a separate effort for recovery of lamprey. It is not part of the Lower Columbia Conservation Recovery Plan, which focuses just on the anadromous fish. Chum, unfortunately, are extirpated from the system. We do have some projects that are listed as having benefited chum. And this is actually from Project Tracker. If you go to the page that has the focal species, it lists out the number of projects that focus on each of the species. So I'll be talking about this in a little bit more detail, but it's important to recognize that bull trout and Pacific lamprey aren't part of the Lower Columbia Conservation Recovery Plan, which we tiered off of in the development of the strategic plan and the OWEB FIP package, which is focused on anadromous fish, but it also complements the other populations, Pacific lamprey and bull trout. So OWEB FIP restoration activities, what's the focus for that? It's really focused in on rearing and migratory habitat complexity and access. And I explained before that complexity are things like large wood in the stream, as well as a variety of habitats out there. Access includes access into, for example, side channels that are cut off, floodplain areas, and then for Johnson Creek, access into cold water tributaries. The idea of the OWEB FIP portion was to really focus on the Lower Columbia Recovery Plan at their metrics and take those metrics and look at them at the scale of each individual small watershed. So look at the limiting factors for Deep Creek, for Eagle Creek, for Clear Creek, et cetera. And what we found from that is that the primary metrics that we're using as we tier off the Lower Columbia Plan are large wood placement, side channel increase, riparian planting, and off-channel wetland complex increase. Those are all metrics that are being tracked in the recovery plan. Those are all metrics that they see contributing to the Clackamas populations. And I'll get into a little bit more detail on those later. So the emphasis is on Clackamas River migratory and rearing habitat. So it's really a river focus, as you'll see with the projects. There also are some Willamette River projects, and then there are projects in the tributaries, including the lower river tributaries, Abernathy, Kellogg, and Johnson Creek. In this case, with Abernathy and Kellogg, they did not submit projects for OWEB FIP because they were kind of behind the curve in terms of developing watershed assessments and then identifying prioritized projects. So in Kellogg Creek right now, they're conducting a watershed assessment to determine what their project priorities are. And as we look over the next two biennia, there may be possibilities to bring in projects there. Abernathy Creek is also an area where we have a pending grant proposal through OWEB FIP to do a watershed assessment there and also prioritize projects. There's some questions about whether there will be OWEB funding for that. So there's some open questions whether that can move forward, but that's a bigger issue. So the restoration activities in the strategic plan are broader than the focus on habitat complexity and access. So it includes things like improving road drainage so that you minimize the delivery of sediment to stream channels, that sort of thing. It includes riparian enhancement as a separate project. In OWEB FIP, riparian enhancement is part of complexity projects, but that's the only way that is funded through FIP if it complements a project and is part of an overall complexity project. So that's the distinction here. Within the strategic plan, you could pursue riparian enhancement projects as a whole separate category that wouldn't necessarily have to be attached to a complexity project. Addressing fish passage barriers, I use the example of Kellogg Dam. And then finally, promoting best management practices. So working with landowners, I'm involved in a project right now in the Malala, for example, where we're looking at BMPs that will improve water quality there with a variety of landowners, agriculture, rural residential, et cetera. So FIP restoration activities, as I said, address the primary limiting factor that's in the Lower Columbia Recovery Plan: habitat complexity and access to off-channel habitats. We didn't just take the Lower Columbia Plan and say, okay, this is the limiting factor. We actually went through another analysis of data that we looked at that confirmed that, both for tributaries and for the Clackamas. So we certainly concluded in the end that that was the primary limiting factor, but it varies from subwatershed to subwatershed. Fish passage barriers linking cold-water habitat in Johnson Creek is a specific focus in OWEB FIP. It's really important to understand that to apply for OWEB FIP funding, you have to have a defined geography and you have to have a carefully defined set of project types that you are focusing on. And this essentially describes that. So with that, why don't I open it up for any questions at this point? Why don't you go ahead and use the chat box. Cheryl, so I don't have to pop out of the presentation. Could you go ahead and read off the questions, and then we can accept phone calls after the chat box questions, if there are any. Any questions?
I'm looking at the chat box now. There is a question from Dave Bugney. Is there documentation, data, and evaluation describing, 1, why particular restoration projects were developed over all other potential projects within the basin? And 2, what formal evaluations and rankings were performed to compare selected projects to one another? And 3, how cost-benefit analyses, value engineering, and life cycle costs, where applicable, were implemented to arrive at the greatest benefit to fish recovery for the least cost in order to maximize the use of the FIP funds across the basin.
Can you restate the first question?
Yeah. Why particular restoration projects were developed over all the other potential projects within the basin?
So I think this is focused on OWEB FIP, and we went through a prioritization process for the projects that we selected, and I think that's what this question really gets to. And we based the projects on a couple of things. One is, what were the limiting factors that we uncovered through our process? And we wanted to make sure that the projects addressed those limiting factors. And second, we wanted, and we evaluated projects in terms of how they would benefit, particularly juvenile rearing, because we were building off of the fantastic PGE accomplishments in terms of fish passage through the system, both in terms of spawners getting up above the projects, but in particular the spectacular number of juveniles that are now surviving through the system and getting down into the lower river. So that became a big prioritization, was providing habitat, particularly in the river, but in confluence areas, et cetera, that would accommodate all the additional juveniles that are coming down. They're both moving through those systems, stopping and feeding and rearing as they move down. We also looked at projects in terms of cost effectiveness. Cost was certainly a part of our evaluation process, but we knew that what we were tackling were projects that are difficult sometimes to fund because they're big floodplain projects. Obviously, there's a variety of projects in OWEB FIP, but I would say that the primary focus, certainly in terms of expenditures, is on the larger floodplain projects that are reconnecting side channels, providing floodplain access, habitat complexity. So that's really where the focus was. And when we went to OWEB with that package, we scheduled out projects in all 3 biennia. And currently we're obviously implementing biennia 1 projects. We knew that there was less certainty about projects into biennia 2 and 3, but we did list out potential projects for those. What we are going to go through, and there's actually, we discussed this today at the TAC meeting, is a reprioritization of those projects in subsequent biennia, because we have to submit a work plan to OWEB that describes the projects for each biennia. So we'll be working soon on the 2nd biennia, and we'll go through and reprioritize all of those projects. So that's the effort that went into it, and there's lots of details on it, and I can certainly answer questions about some of the details around the prioritization, but that gives you a kind of a big picture. Next question.
And so 2 and 3 of that, I think you touched on what formal evaluations and rankings were performed to compare selected projects, and how cost-benefit analyses value engineering and life cycle costs.
Well, yeah, we didn't do value engineering or life cycle costs. That would be something that could follow with some of these projects, but we didn't pursue that kind of paradigm.
But isn't it true, John, that the full life cycles were considered as part of the weighted ranking if it addressed migration, rearing, and spawning?
Oh, like fish life cycle. Oh yeah, fish life cycles. I thought you meant the life cycle of the particular project. No, we certainly looked at the life cycle of fish, and that was key because we wanted to identify areas that would be used by juvenile Chinook, et cetera, as they came down the system.
And Laura had a question on how long the strategic plan is set to be implemented.
So the OWEB FIP is through 2026. And so we attached the strategic plan to that same timeline. And the idea is that through the life cycle of the projects, we have a pretty robust effectiveness monitoring system. So we're going to be learning along the way as we move through the 2 biennia to 2026. And then it's built into the strategic plan that at that point, you would reevaluate where things are, look at any emerging issues, for example, climate change, other issues that might come up in the basin, and then revise the strategic plan accordingly. So it's through 2026 with the idea that this will continue forward with Clackamas partnership. Obviously, OWEB funding is only slated through 2026, but this gives you then the foundation to revise the strategic plan and incorporate new priorities, et cetera.
I am unmuting Dave Bugney. He did clarify his intention was on the economic life cycle, which I think you had addressed.
Yeah, I'm not sure I answered the question there. We looked at individual projects, made estimates of what the budgets were for those individual projects, and that obviously encompassed monitoring, which is another component of it, and evaluation. So that part of the cycle certainly built into it. There's certainly learning with monitoring, but no, not in the way that I think you're stating it. More questions? Should I move on, Cheryl?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any others.
Okay. So as I said before, with the FIP restoration activities, we're addressing the Lower Columbia Plan habitat complexity metrics. And I'd like to kind of talk about that a little bit more. What was that? That was an interesting sound. And as I said, the emphasis is on Clackamas River migratory and rearing habitat. So if you look at the projects we have, and if you look at the expenditures, that really dominates OWEB FIP focus. We have some Willamette River projects, and we also are looking at tributary areas. And it's important to note that those also benefit upper Willamette Basin runs. So they do benefit, obviously, Clackamas fish populations, but they have a big benefit for upper Willamette runs too. And that's something that's pretty unique, I think, about our effort. And it's really important, I think, to note that Abernathy, Kellogg, and Johnson Creek watersheds also contribute to Clackamas fish population recovery because those systems are unique. They contribute to sort of the spatial diversity of the overall population. And so they really aren't to be discounted in terms of their overall contributions. And certainly when we were looking at those tributaries, we were trying to think about what the key limiting factors were for the focal fish species, but also thinking about how ultimately they can contribute to the overall spatial diversity of the population, complementing obviously the Clackamas portion of it, which is obviously the most important area. We also looked at tributary confluences and also thinking about how the tributaries, well, the Clackamas too, but the tributaries can contribute to cold water refugia, which, as I'll address later, is a big issue in the lower Willamette. So these are the metrics that are in the Lower Columbia Recovery Plan specific to the Clackamas populations. And so for each of the metrics, large wood, side channel increase, riparian planting, and off-channel wetland complex increase, they listed goals specific to the Clackamas population for delisting. And you can see what they are there. For example, miles of large wood placement at a certain amount, 62.5 miles. If you look at our accomplishments, this is through 2016, and I'll contrast it with 2018 a little bit. You can see that already there was considerable progress towards that goal, over 25% towards that goal. When you look at riparian planting, thanks quite honestly to shade our streams, you were already very near that goal in 2016, over 95% of the riparian planting miles, and substantial amount of off-channel wetland complex increase. So already in 2016, when we were developing the strategic plan, there had been substantial progress made on these kind of key metrics for fish recovery. And honestly, much of that, the accomplishments really go to Clackamas River Basin Council. So a really good job there. And then if you look at 2018, and again, these are ESA anadromous salmonid focus, you can see that basically you hit it out of the ballpark in terms of riparian planting. And again, that's shade our streams. You've actually exceeded the delisting goal there already in 2018. And you've exceeded the metric for off-channel wetland habitat increased by a huge amount. So it's really interesting, and I think the plan's eventually going to have to recalibrate when it looks at these numbers. But basically, you are hitting the ball out of the ballpark. And when you look at the other populations that comprise the Lower Columbia Recovery Plan, no one is even close to this in terms of what's been accomplished. So the OWEB FIP is really building a foundation on top of already these great accomplishments. It's also important to note that it's more than just salmonid focus. The strategic plan is also focused on Pacific lamprey and bull trout, and they are also part of what we're calling the Clackamas populations. The Clackamas plays a really important role in the context of Pacific lamprey recovery in the Willamette Basin. It really is the stronghold for Pacific lamprey in the Willamette. And if you look at this map here, which was a recent analysis of the status of the various populations in the Willamette, you can see that the Clackamas really stands out. while the population is vulnerable, it has the lowest extinction risk of any of the Willamette watersheds. Basically, the rest of the Willamette Basin, the watersheds are critically imperiled or imperiled in terms of lamprey populations. It's also worth noting that the tributaries to the Willamette, the smaller tributaries like Abernathy, Johnson, and Kellogg, are also important to lamprey. If you look at the number of spawning lamprey in Abernathy Creek, it's astounding the number of lamprey that move into that system. So those other tributaries provide an important component of lamprey recovery also. Obviously, the Clackamas River Basin is important for bull trout recovery. You have bull trout that have been moved into the system. They were extirpated and moved back in, and there's a bull trout recovery plan that's being implemented right now with the Forest Service and others, Forest Service, ODFW and others. And so we don't have an emphasis in the OWEB FIP strategy on bull trout recovery other than just letting this process move forward. So far, all indications are that the population is improving over time. But we felt it was important to include that in the strategic plan because it's certainly part of the overall native fish recovery efforts in the Clackamas River Basin. So I want to talk a little bit about Clackamas Project Tracker. We adapted a system from Sitka Technology Group that is an online database to the needs of the Clackamas Partnership. And what it essentially is a web-based database that allows us to follow and input projects all the way through the project lifecycle, from proposals through prioritization, design, permitting, construction, and post-project grant reporting. So it follows a project all the way through that. It's visible to the partnership, but also to the public and depending on how we configure the system. But it's a great opportunity to sort of see all the projects together. And quite honestly, it made the strategic planning process go a lot more smoothly than it would otherwise, because it gave us one landing spot where we could see the project proposals. We could then work through the prioritization. And now as we move into design permitting, we can update the information in Project Tracker, follow it through. And then importantly, we can track a number of things like funding levels, including match. We can track accomplishments in there, and we have a whole set of performance measures that are built into Project Tracker that will allow the project proponent at the end of the project to enter in all the key metrics around how much large wood was placed, how much, what's the area of side channel habitat that was increased, what's the area of floodplain, wetland complex area that is increased. So all of those things can be tracked in Project Tracker, and we can aggregate it and report it out to OWEB, other funding sources, and stakeholders. So really a nice tool, and it's evolving. Since we were the first instance to set it up after a program in Lake Tahoe, that was where it was originally developed with EPA funding. We tiered off the Lake Tahoe platform, adapted it for our work, and since then it's expanded out to the Puget Sound Partnership, the Bureau of Reclamation, soil and water conservation districts in California now are using this overall to assess all their programs statewide. And what's cool is it's created this community of folks who are using a similar platform, and we essentially can share in upgrades as they occur over time. And so, for example, the Bureau of Reclamation recently paid for the functionality of allowing the system to essentially rank projects within the system. And they funded that. That's something that potentially we could take on within our system. So it's an evolving kind of ecosystem with this platform among other smart organizations, partnerships, including notably the John Day FIP ended up adopting this platform too. So it's definitely caught the eye of other FIPs. OWEB also appreciates this as a platform. It's geographically based, and so we track proposals and projects both at a 6-field watershed level, and we've defined 39 watersheds. And incidentally, for all of those watersheds, we also work through what we think the limiting factors are for each of those watersheds. Obviously, that can evolve over time. But this becomes the geographic framework then that we can use for tracking projects by watersheds, and then also by river reaches. There's 3 Clackamas river reaches, and then 1 Willamette river reach. And Project Tracker has really robust mapping capabilities, so we can display where projects are. We can query it and say, okay, what projects are in Deep Creek, and it all comes together there. We also adopted a project review process for OWEB FIP, where we prioritize projects. They're reviewed by the TAC, the partnership's TAC, and then it goes to the OWEB technical review team, TRT, for review. They look at it in terms of project readiness, et cetera. We still go through the online application process, and then changes to the project application responded to with based on comments from the TRT, and then ultimately it's approved and it moves forward for funding. So we do this each biennia. Obviously, we've working through the first biennia projects now, and then we're going to go through the second biennia starting in the fall, work through prioritization for those, and then obviously into the third biennia. So there's really a robust review process, and I'm really impressed with the way the TAC is working together as we collaborate and coordinate, which is a challenge, all of these projects over time. And it's really important to understand that the project money goes to the individual applicant. So if it's a project in Johnson Creek, it goes to the Johnson Creek Watershed Council, and they are responsible to meet the grant obligations around that. So similar for CRBC, obviously you receive the OWEB money and you're responsible for that particular grant and project. I mentioned performance measures in Project Tracker, and this is just a selected list of the performance measures that we have in there that kind of capture the kind of key metrics: large wood placement, off-channel wetland area increase. We have a bunch of riparian metrics, both in terms of native planting and invasive species removal, side channel habitat increase, stream habitat accessible. And then if you look at these metrics that are on the bottom here, they are not necessarily relevant to OWEB FIP, but they are relevant to the broader strategic plan. And it's set up in there so that, for example, we could track roads that are decommissioned. The U.S. Forest Service, for example, has decommissioned a lot of roads that they don't use anymore, roads that are contributing a lot of sediment to streams, roads that potentially could trigger slides, that sort of thing. They put a lot of those to bed. They've decommissioned those. And there's ways that we can track that in Project Tracker. We can also track road BMPs, for example, like if new relief culverts are put in to minimize sediment delivery, that sort of thing. There's also sedimentation and improved hydrology. It would be part of what you would look at when you're putting roads to bed. There's stormwater BMPs implemented. There's actually a metric for that, and then tracking riparian rules, which, I talked to Cheryl about. This is actually something that CBRC looks at. Obviously, there are rules within jurisdictions, the county. This came up in discussions about, what are other ways that you can influence watershed health, obviously. The other really nice feature in Project Tracker is that you can easily produce reports. And this is one of the summary sheets or project fact sheets that comes out of the system. And in this case, it's for a completed project on Johnson Creek, culvert project, habitat access project. And it's nice because it reports things like, what are the focal species, how much habitat was opened up. In this case, it was 1.5 miles. It includes the expenditures for the project. As you can see here, a variety of funding sources, including PGE, OWEB, and Metro in this case. So really nice communication tool for both stakeholders and funders. This is an example from the Clackamas River Basin. And here it's a proposed project. There isn't complete information, obviously, for the budget, but you can see how we can target performance measures, large wood placement, repairing floodplain, invasive species, native planting, as well as side channel habitat. Obviously a big project that's moving forward. This is the next page of the Riverbend project, just showing additional features that are in the project fact sheets. You can include photos. We have the concept design in there. As the project moves forward, we can continue to add information to this. And we're also looking at ways that we can modify the fact sheets. Right now it's kind of standardized, but looking at ways that we can modify them depending on the audience. Project Tracker also has really robust mapping tools. And this is two maps showing the lower basin, the upper basin, and showing projects implemented by biennia. This was for our planning process. And what's nice about Project Tracker is that you can export information into GIS, and that's what we actually did for these maps that are in the strategic plan. But within Project Tracker, you can also sort things out by who's proposing projects, by geographic area, by implementation date, by types. It has really robust mapping features. And when you go to the sort of the first page in Project Tracker, there's a map there with the various projects and their status. You can click on any of those projects and up will pop a thumbnail that gives you kind of the basics on the project. And from there, you can get into even more detail. So really a nice way to view projects. So now I want to switch gears a little bit. The strategic plan does talk about climate change, and it lists out project types that could improve and help mitigate for climate change, provide resiliency from climate change, particularly in terms of maintaining cold water. And so a lot of the activities that the partnership's involved in, for example, reconnecting side channels, floodplains, et cetera, can contribute to cold water. And I think that's a really important aspect of this, and certainly an important aspect of climate change resiliency. I also want to note, and I think most of you are aware of it, that Clackamas River water providers are sponsoring a study by PSU that's broadly looking at climate change and potential actions that could come out of that in terms of resiliency. And I think it's a really good study. They've covered a lot of components, and I think there'll be opportunities to incorporate findings from that into strategies and on-the-ground actions. So here I want to just focus on what Clackamas FIP is doing in terms of cold water areas. And I mentioned side channel and floodplain connectivity that can contribute to cold water, both in terms of connecting in areas that have cold water, but in some cases by allowing floodplain connectivity, you get flood flows over that, and you can get gradual release of cold water over time. So really trying to reset those processes. Obviously, stream flow regimes are important to maintaining cold water, improving riparian shade. Regrading incised channels is another way that often you can reconnect to the floodplain and cold water. And then finally, access into cold water tributaries. The example would be in Johnson Creek, where they are reconnecting cold water tributaries that previously had fish passage barriers. This is the Parsons side channel, just to kind of illustrate how you can have much colder groundwater influences in contrast to the Clackamas River. You can see a dramatic lower temperature in the channel where there's groundwater inputs. So really significant, and you know, this is where the fish will congregate. There's no doubt about it. So an important aspect, and one that we'll be looking at. One of the conversations we had today with the TAC was, what are ways that we can look at effectiveness of reconnecting side channels, reconnecting floodplains, and obviously looking at water temperature is a kind of a key metric. I want to talk about a recent study that was completed by DEQ, where they went through a very intensive effort of looking at cold water refugia in the main stem of the Willamette River, and with a focus on the lower Willamette River. And out of that study, they were able to define what cold water refuge is. Well, they're both able to characterize it and define it. And so what they defined it as is an area that is at least 2 degrees C temperature reduction from the main stem, so 2 degrees C cooler than the Willamette River for a tributary. And they defined what they consider is high quality cold water refugia. So it has at least a 2 degrees C temperature reduction, and the maximum temperature is within the range of optimal temperatures for salmon and steelhead of 18 degrees C or less. 18 degrees C is around 64 degrees, 64.4 degrees. So really cool. And so what they looked at was the migration temperature standard, which is 20 degrees C. And then they looked at where there were areas that were at least 2 degrees cooler than that and were below 18 degrees C. And I want to give you a couple of examples, and these are essentially FLIR infrared images, remote sensing. I don't know if they were by drone or a plane. I need to find that out. But regardless, it is remotely sensed and sort of abstract when you look at it here. You've got Johnson Creek coming into the Willamette. And if you look over on the right, you can see the scale there. The purple temperatures are colder, essentially. So this is a cold water input into the Willamette. It diffuses out into the Willamette River. And in this case, Johnson Creek is colder than Willamette. And when you think about it, Johnson Creek has cold water springs in the lower portion. There's Crystal Springs Creek and other cold water inputs there. So it's certainly colder than many other tributaries. And it was colder than the Willamette River. It was slightly less than 20 degrees C, but it didn't qualify as a high quality a cold water refugia habitat because it wasn't colder than 18 degrees C consistently. But you look at the Clackamas River in contrast, and you see a big purple plume coming down, and you realize that in August, when water temperatures are high, the Clackamas River contributes quite a bit of flow to the Willamette. If you look at it, about 100 CFS, 1,000 CFS, which would be, you know, an August level, I suppose. Up to 10% of the Willamette River's flow is contributed by the Clackamas. And what's significant is it's the only tributary that contributed cold water at a significant distance in the into the Willamette, and contributed cold water that is greater than 2 degrees C than the Willamette. So it's a large plume of cold water that continues downstream at least a quarter mile through Melbourne Bar Park, and that essentially extends the refugia habitat out quite a ways. So really significant. And the fact that it's 4 to 6 degrees cooler than the Willamette means that it's really a high quality cold water refuge. So that's really important to keep in mind. An incredible contribution from the Clackamas. And it's interesting when you look at this diagram, you can look over on the west bank of the Willamette and you look along the edge and you see cold water seeps along there. That's the beauty of this technology. And those are important too. You find that rearing fish will move into those kind of micro habitats and use those. So this tells the story of a large plume coming out of the Clackamas, but also those kind of micro habitats that also provide cold water refuge. So DEQ is looking at now rules that will essentially focus on ways to protect cold water habitats, cold water refugia like this, and obviously the Clackamas is really significant. Okay, with that, I will open it up again for questions. That ends my presentation.
Alrighty. Alrighty, are you all able to hear me?
Yep.
I'm going to unmute all for the moment. Bill Monroe had 2 questions. Bill?
Forgot to unmute my phone.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So the Clackamas River met or exceeded its goals, but what about the other partners, Johnson Creek and Kellogg, Abernathy?
I'm sorry, Bill, I couldn't hear you very well. What you said that there are goals for the Clackamas River, but not goals for Abernathy.
Well, the Clackamas met its goals, but I was curious about how the other partner watersheds are doing.
John, I think as the Clackamas is listed, those factor into our contribution.
Yeah, so in Johnson Creek, the goals there in OWEB FIP are twofold. One is to reconnect cold water tributaries, and the other is complexity projects in the lower part of Johnson Creek. So those are the goals there. For Kellogg Creek and for Abernathy Creek, we went through and listed what the limiting factors are based on best professional judgment. And quite honestly, it was a bunch of folks from ODFW, including Todd Alsbury and others, who developed the limiting factors for the tributaries. In Abernathy and Kellogg Creek, we currently don't have any prioritized projects in the FIP process. And you know that you participated in the TAC today. Currently, Kellogg is doing a watershed assessment for Kellogg Creek, which ultimately will come out with some prioritized projects. Abernathy Creek also is slated to have a watershed assessment that'll identify projects and prioritize them also, but they haven't done that at this point. There'll be the potential in the future to add projects to the FIP list out of Abernathy, Kellogg, if they can come up with some priorities and depending on how it fits into the mix of other projects. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you. And then the only other question I had, can you, and there's no telling, there's no predicting what's going to happen with this COVID business, but we've had a letter from OWEB saying that lottery revenue is going to be down and kind of cautioning everyone that there are going to be some potential budget constraints. Can you discuss at all how that's going to affect us?
Oh boy, I'm the wrong one to ask that. I think Cheryl probably can address it. She participated in the phone call. We're already seeing some potential impacts though to OWEB, to the FIP program, because basically any projects where the grant agreement's been signed, those are all funded, but there are still some outstanding projects from this biennia that we are developing that they haven't signed the grant agreement. The assessment for Kellogg Creek or for Abernathy Creek is an example of that. And I worry that they may not be able to fund that discrete project. So it's certainly going to have an impact. But other than that, I haven't been briefed on what the current budget status is. Cheryl, do you want to add to that?
There is uncertainty, isn't there? OWEB put a pause on executing future grant agreements. So first of all, to emphasize that future grant agreements, any current grant agreements that are in place will proceed as normal with full funding. We're on a pause for future OWEB grant agreements as they learn more about how the lottery funds might impact their abilities. That's one source of state-based funding. Our fifth is addresses one of the priorities of OWEB board, that is for native fish species and improving habitat. That qualifies for the federal Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund. So in certain ways, we're in better shape than other FIPs that address, say, sage grouse or oak savanna, where it doesn't fall under that funding source. The OWEB board meets in June after they've received their projection of what the lottery revenue will bring, and then they'll resume some grant agreements once again. We just don't know what amount yet, so there's a couple months pause. We also know that in July of 2019, our entire biennium was approved by the OWEB board, so we may be sitting in favorable consideration on that basis also. That's all I'd be able to say at this time.
Thanks,
okay,
Cheryl.
thank you, and thank you, John. This has been really very informative.
Let me just add one other thing to the funding picture, and this is actually funding that's being catalyzed by COVID-19, and that is infrastructure funding. I had calls last week from NOAA Fisheries, from staffers, congressional staffers, asking me if I knew of potential projects out there that could go into a stimulus funding bill. And if you remember the recession in 2008, 2009, there was actually an effort then to identify restoration projects that could qualify for stimulus funding. And a number of dams were taken out. I know there was one, Gold Ray Dam, down on the Clackamas, I believe, or not Clackamas, down in the Rogue Basin that was taken out with stimulus funding. One of the projects that I did mention to them is Kellogg Dam, because that involves both the dam but also the bridge there, which was built in the 1930s and is still okay, but has some structural issues and is not seismically sound. That would be the kind of project that potentially could go into that sort of infrastructure stimulus funding. So I would encourage you all and the partnership to think about any potential projects that could fit that sort of criteria.
Thank you, John. Everyone is unmuted at this time. If there are other questions, would you say your name, please?
It's Dave Bugney.
John?
Dave Bugney and then John.
So
No, this is Lowell Hanna. I'll wait in line.
Okay, Dave Bugney, then Lowell.
okay, my question I have is, could you just please further elaborate a little bit on the responsibilities between the TAC, the TRT, and the OWEB? That is, how information flows from one group to the other and what the responsibilities are?
So the responsibilities of the TAC are to develop projects, prioritize them, work with the project sponsor to flesh out the project, make sure that it's a good project proposal. And try to provide some common themes and framework for how we're approaching things, so that the entire partnership is approaching proposals the same, it's approaching prioritization the same. And then they forward those proposals on to the TRT. The TRT's role is to review those proposals and to provide advice on how to improve them. They're not there to reject proposals necessarily, but to really try to make them better projects. So that's the relationship. I don't know, Cheryl, if you want to add any more to that.
I think you had a good, complete response. OWEB board has approved our work plan based on the application submitted in summer of 2018.
So then after it proceeds from the TAC to the TRT, then I assume it goes to OWEB and they are the ones that make the final decision on whether to approve or deny the application?
I think it's really the TRT that approves or denies it and recommends it to OWEB. I don't think OWEB, other than for funding reasons, would decline a project that had been approved by the TRT.
Correct, because in essence, they have approved all projects we're proposing based on that application for an OWEB, Focused Investment Partnership Implementation Grant. And then Lowell had a question. Lowell?
Yes, John, you mentioned that the Clackamas during the summer months is about 10% of the flow going down the Willamette below the falls. During that period of time, is there a chance to slow the flow from the upper falls, like at Green Peter and Detroit reservoirs, where there would be down, their water flow, they're letting it out for the winter, but can we slow that down so that 10% that's coming out of the Clackamas will be a higher percentage of flow because of the serious problem we have in the Portland area, what they call the dead zone. And if we can get that cold water going farther downstream, we'd have a better chance of returning fish.
Boy, I wish I had a quick answer for that. It's complex because most of those dams are run by the Army Corps of Engineers. They have rule curves for how they release the water. There's various other things going on, like they're looking at selective temperature withdrawals in the Santiam at Detroit Reservoir. The McKinsey contributes a huge amount of cold water to the system up there. But currently the way that the entire system is managed with the reservoirs and flows, they're not looking at maximizing ecological values for the lower Willamette. Let's put it that way.
John,
John Borden.
Hey, John.
May I speak?
Yes.
All right. John Runyon, I think you're exactly right. I work with the Corps of Engineers and others on the rule curves, and they're almost sacrosanct. And the dams on the Willamette system are mostly built for flood control, hydropower, navigation, and agriculture. And those rule curves are hard to change. We succeeded once when I was with the Water Resources Department in convincing them during a dry period of about 3 years that they should withhold 5% more than they normally would. In other words, rise above their rule curve. And what do you suppose happened? That was the year we got a lot of excess water, and so flooding occurred. And we were beaten to a pulp as a result of doing that. So we gave up on trying to cause the Corps to modify its rule curve. So I would say good luck.
Doug DeHart.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Doug DeHart, I've got something to insert here if it's helpful.
Sure.
What I wanted to add was actually water out of Green Peter and Detroit reservoirs midsummer is quite a bit colder than the main stem Willamette. So I don't think what you would want to do in midsummer would be to reduce outflow from those large upriver storage reservoirs in any case to produce a colder lower river. I think you'd produce a hotter lower river by doing that. There were actually some agreements, hard fought, I grant you, in the Willamette biological opinion, that where the Corps actually committed to some increases in summer flow rather than keeping places like Detroit Reservoir up to near full for recreation all summer long. So the Corps has changed their focus a bit. And I think as far as water temperature goes, that's been a plus.
I appreciate the education.
Thank you, Roel.
Any other questions?
Oh, I have another question, if possible.
Sure.
Question I have is, you mentioned climate change, which I thought was very good. And the question I have is, in the future, will consideration be given to restoration projects in the lower tributary creeks that currently have very cold water and currently have heavily intact forest canopies, so that they're already there? There's that buffer that can provide cold water not only as a refugia, but also as during the freshwater life stages of spawning and rearing. You know, I think of like Upper Clear Creek or most of Eagle Creek, for example. Are those going to be on a list in the future?
So if those tributaries, if you look at the strategic plan, those are slated for some projects, but also importantly within the context of strategic plan, those are also identified as areas where habitat protection could be a good strategy to protect those areas that are you know, intact riparian, cold water, et cetera. And there's actually built into the FIP funding the potential to study areas that could provide water quality benefits through habitat protection as well as habitat benefits. So there is a study built into the FIP that can look at that. We were trying to build off of work that was done in the McKinsey with Eugene Water and Electric Board, where they've worked with OWEB and other funding to protect key habitat areas that also contribute to water quality there. And so there's a framework within the strategic plan to do that sort of thing. And certainly climate change is in the plan. Certainly protecting cold water areas is consistent with the plan.
So I guess just one last thing, just to further elaborate on that. To me, it's one thing to protect that area, but if the area also suffers from degraded habitat complexity, you know, you may be getting a source of water that may be delivered elsewhere, but you're not taking advantage of those areas that could also be restored and not only protected, particularly those areas that would be hard to protect from the standpoint they're not federal or state or county land, but a lot of that is private land where there's still cold water running through there, but it seems like some restoration could also be considered in addition to protection where it was appropriate.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And what they're doing in the McKinsey is just that. In many cases, they do include restoration as part of the protection. What they've been working on there is long-term easements with landowners as a way to compensate the landowners, but still provide some flexibility.
Thanks.
Any more questions?
You provided such a good overview and a lot of information, John. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, it was fun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
We'll see you guys.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Take care, everyone.
Cheryl?
Thank you.
And we have recorded this presentation and hope to have it available on our website. I hear someone asking a question.
Yeah, Cheryl? This is
Yes.
Bill. Gail raises a great point, and everybody, I believe, gets the notices of the TAC meetings, and you're certainly welcome to sit in on those, even if we ever have them again in person, but certainly by phone as an observer. But they're open to everybody.
Yes,
Well,
and there was a question about how projects in the future will be considered. For example, the North Eagle Creek project is entered into Project Tracker, and that's what we do.
Good.
I appreciate the opportunity that this system has brought for me to be informed on what's going on in the basin and the council. So this seems to have worked pretty darn well, and as far as I'm concerned, maybe we can, if we are still stuck in our homes, maybe we can still do this on a regular basis. Good for you, Lowell. Maybe now you'll get a computer.
Glad you liked it.
Lots of luck with that, Bill. I do have an Apple phone.
Now you can do a lot with the phone.
It's a great way for everybody to stay engaged.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thanks for everybody for being here tonight.
Yeah, I'm
Thank you.
hoping we're going to do this again next month.
Yeah, I think we're planning on it. Yep. Sounds good.
And John, I'd like to say thank you for all your help and all you've done getting us to this point. It's pretty awesome.
It's been fun.
Absolutely.
It's an adventure.
Cheryl, I guess that's a wrap.
That's a wrap. I've stopped recording.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Stay safe.
Thanks for joining.